Welcome back. A couple of weeks ago, because I hadn't played e4 in so long and I have decided to start playing it again, I gave myself a refresher course on e4 as the first move for white and the 4 most common responses by black. But I didn't get a chance to go in depth on any of those openings, just kind of looked at the basic ideas, what the opponent is trying to do, what white's trying to do. And since then, several of you have made recommendations to me as to which openings I should study if I'm going to play e4 with the white pieces. And I have 5 of them listed. By far the one that was mentioned the most was the Italian game, and coming in at a close second was the Vienna game. Other people mentioned the 4 Knights Scotch, the Ponziani Opening, and the Scotch Gambit. Now, I have heard of all of these before, and in fact, I know the first several moves of the Italian game and the first couple of moves of the Vienna game. In other words, I would recognize them if they're played. But the 4 Knights Scotch, the Ponziani, and the Scotch Gambit, I'm probably not familiar enough with those to even tell you what the first few moves are. So I'm going to look those up on the opening database on Lichess. And by the end of this video, I may or may not decide which opening I'm going to start trying to play with the white pieces when I play e4 as my first move. Of course, that depends on black playing e5. If black doesn't play e5, if black plays c5, well, we're playing the Sicilian defense. And if black plays d5, we're playing the Scandinavian. And if black plays c6, then we're playing the Caro-Kann defense, and so on. We can also, at black's insistence, play the Pirtz defense or the French defense, those kind of things. But if I play e4 and black plays e5, then I have the choice of the next move. On the other screen, I have pulled up the analysis board and the book moves listed. I've decided to take the openings that you suggested in the reverse order by number of mentions, and the Scotch Gambit is the one that I have pulled up on the board right now. Now, I actually reached this position not too long ago playing the center game, it just in a different move order. So if we back up, the Scotch Gambit is when black plays e5 in response to e4, and I get the knight out to f3, and black plays the most common move, which is knight to c6. This is, of course, the Ruy Lopez. I think if we put the bishop here, we're asking for the Italian game. Right now, if we play d4, suddenly it's the Scotch game. And almost every time, black is going to take back with that pawn in the center, and moving the bishop out to c4 becomes the Scotch game, Scotch Gambit. I just learned this a few minutes ago before I started recording this video. I think like all the major openings, it attempts to do the same thing, which is to control center squares and place pieces on squares where they control center squares. And the way that I reached this from the center game not too long ago was after black plays e5, if white plays d4, that's the center game. Now, usually white will take here, and then I can get this knight out to threaten the pawn with 2 pieces. They'll get this knight out for no particular reason. They're not defending this pawn because I can still take it because I have 2 pieces attacking it. But then if I pull my bishop here, suddenly we've transitioned and we're not in the center game anymore. We're in the Scotch Gambit. So I do understand, I think, the ideas of the Scotch Gambit. I mean, I'm ready to castle. We're on move 4 and I'm ready to castle. Black's not ready to castle at all. They have both those minor pieces still stuck between the king and the rook. They can, of course, get one out now. And the most common move here is this, and that's a very close second. Using the opening book for my level, they're not ready to castle on the other side either. And white's ready to castle now. White's controlling several center squares and is occupying a couple of center squares, center adjacent squares. So I think that's decent. I don't know that there's any trick to this other than just doing a move order that the opponent might not have studied, or might not have studied as much as, say, the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game, being far more common. This is something that I think I can play. As I've pointed out, I can reach it in a couple of different move orders. I'm ready to castle. I'm ready to retake that pawn. This dark squared bishop has several squares it can go to here in just a minute. The knight can't get out just yet. Well, not to there. And if it gets out over here, well, it's blocking the queen's attack on that pawn. So that knight can just wait a second, I guess. Or maybe here it is black's move. So if they do get this bishop out to protect that pawn, which is the most common move, as I said, or get this knight out, which attacks my pawn, then I'll have to, possibly adjust. I do know that one possibility here is to play c3. At least it looks like it, because if they take, I can automatically develop my knight there. But I would just have to look at those. So let's see, what do I play if they bring this knight out? Because they are attacking this pawn. Okay, it says if they do that, I just push that pawn. Well, that makes sense. The only thing attacking it on that square is their other knight, and that square is defended by my knight, so they wouldn't take it there. So if I pushed forward, then they would have to move that knight, would they? It says the most common move here is d5. Oh, okay. Well, that attacks my bishop. I have several choices. I could take the knight. I could en passant the pawn that just moved to save my bishop, or I could just move the bishop back one. What does Stockfish recommend here? Stockfish says moving the bishop into the Ruy Lopez position is much better than all the other options. Okay. and that is the most common move played by white here, but black has a slightly higher win rate in this position, according to that opening book. If I move there, they're still in trouble here, but now they can move the knight here and it's protected, and I don't like that at all, because then what do I do? So that's the most common move here, and now we're even according to Stockfish, but they have a knight positioned right there in the center of my board, patrolling all these squares, and the only way I'm going to be able to get rid of it is to trade off a knight for it, or eventually move this knight and push my f-pawn. But it says what I would do here, and the best move recommended by Stockfish and the most common move here is to take this pawn. And they wouldn't take back, because that would just be a trade there. I've been down a pawn this entire time, and just now caught up. It says what they would do now is get a bishop out, probably this one. And then when they did that, then I would take that knight. That would take some remembering. It would also take my opponent making that exact set of moves, which, as we know at our level, you'll study an opening out to 5 or 6 moves. We're on move 7 here, but you'll almost never reach that exact position because your opponent doesn't know that opening, especially if you've chosen one a little more rare, like the Scotch Gambit or the center game. As I was demonstrating, you could get to the same position through the center game. So your opponent's already out of what little prep that they've done, because they haven't done any more than I have probably, and they've probably studied the more common openings from black's perspective, if they've studied any at all. So they don't know that that was the best move, so they've done something different. Well, I didn't study that move because it wasn't the best response by black, so I don't know what to do then. So that's basically going to be the case as far as I can tell in all of these. But when I said earlier I could probably play c3 before I turned on Stockfish, that reminded me that the next one I wanted to look at was the Ponziani opening. So let's back up. Okay, as I understand it, the Ponziani opening starts about the same way as the Italian game or the Ruy Lopez. That's where I play knight to f3 and they play knight to c6. And again, they're probably expecting either the Italian game or the Ruy Lopez, or if it's an opponent that's watched this video, which hopefully that won't happen too often since my channel is still small, they might be expecting the Scotch Gambit at this point. But in this case right here, I would play c3. And now we're in the Ponziani. Now again, as I understand it, this is about opening principles, trying to control center squares. That square is now controlled by the knight and the c-pawn. Black's best move here is d5 according to Stockfish, but very close is knight to f6, which is the most common according to the opening book here. And again, the knight to f6 attacks my center pawn, but my understanding is that I want to play this. So let's say that they do play knight to f6, protecting this, and then I still play d4. Okay, and then they're still going to attack this? They are, although this is interesting. At my level, by far the most common response is for them to take this pawn. Okay, well, Stockfish says they're about even. Okay, so those are the two things I would have to prepare for if I decided to play the Ponziani. There are other moves here. Stockfish says they could probably play d5 and not be too bad off. The opening book says the third most common move is d6. Well, let's say they played one of the two best moves, which would be capturing here with the e-pawn. Then I would push forward as we saw in the other position, except in the other position, my bishop was already over here. Okay, so I would push forward with the e5, and then they would play their knight to d5. g4 is another fairly common move at my level, but let's say they went to d5 like Stockfish said, then I would take this pawn, right? Because that's the whole reason that I put this here. And they're not going to take, obviously, because that pawn is defended multiple times on my side. But now I've gotten into a situation that we saw with a lot of d4 openings that I played, and that's where the c-pawn is missing, and this diagonal is open. That was, in fact, one reason that I started getting really frustrated with d4 openings, because I would have this d-pawn here, and then later I would shoot forward the c-pawn, which leaves this diagonal open to that bishop. And in fact, bishop to b4 check is the most common move and the move recommended by Stockfish here. Now, in the Queen's Gambit, things like that, or Nimzo Indian, depending on how the d4 opening went, I would block that check with this knight here. But now they have a knight right there defending that square. So I wouldn't want to do that. I would want to block here on d2, either with the knight or the bishop. And the third best move would be a blunder, which is this. I assume that would be a really bad blunder, because then they would take it with this knight. And if I took back with the pawn, then their bishop would be right there pointing at my king and rook at the same time. So I'd have to remember that when they did check on this diagonal to block on d2 with one of those two pieces. But as you saw, if you've seen any of my older videos where back when I was still playing d4 religiously, this was one of my major problems with it, was opening that diagonal and constantly getting into trouble over here, and then being late, getting my pieces out of the way for my king to castle. Because I want to castle, I want to get my pieces out over here and castle. And I certainly don't want to castle queenside with the c-pawn missing. So I'm thinking, of the two I've looked at so far, the Scotch Gambit is a little bit more realistic for me, having made the switch to e4, not only because I can get there by the order I showed, well, by the two orders I showed, I can get there by the center game or by looking like I'm going to play the Italian game or the Ruy Lopez, but then instead play the Scotch Gambit. That one I think I can wrap my head around a little bit more. This one just brings back bad memories of d4 openings where this bishop, or sometimes the queen, ends up over here on this diagonal, and I'm not ready to castle. And instead I'm just defending, which is I'm already doing as black when I play with the black pieces. I don't want to be just caught defending when I'm playing with the white pieces. I think I understand why it's even here and white's not behind. I mean, white has more center space and is controlling more squares. This kind of thing over here, the knight is controlling those two squares and pointing at other squares. It's just that it's suddenly so weak on this side. So thank you to all those that suggested the Ponziani, but I think I'm going to skip that for now. I still have the list. I might come back to it. I'm going to look at the next one, which was the 4 knights Scotch. Let's back up. Okay, if I'm not mistaken, the 4 knights Scotch is reached after white plays knight to f3, black plays knight to c6, and then white gets the other knight out, instead of what we saw in the other openings, which was bringing this bishop out or playing d4. And this is called a 3 knights opening, and if black responds by playing this knight, then you're in the 4 knights game. And now if we play d4, I think this is where we get to the 4 knights Scotch. It's the 4 knights game Scotch variation. If this was what you were talking about, I think I have played this before when I was first getting back into chess. Especially playing faster games like Blitz, you just put the knights out, then the opponent does the same thing, and then you realize you have that square guarded twice, so you throw the d-pawn out too. And of course, getting ready to play this bishop out in castle at some point. My problem with this, I am going to go ahead and look at it just a little bit, but my problem here is that to get there, it requires, in some order, getting all 4 of these knights out. Whereas, in my experience, if I'm trying to get to that because I have studied the 4 knights Scotch, it's not going to happen that often. That's what happens in my experience. If we get to this point here, where my opponent has played knight to c6, again, expecting the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game by bringing this bishop out, and I play this instead, there's no guarantee that my opponent's going to play knight to f6. It is the most common move here, and it's the best move recommended by Stockfish. But they might not, because the opponents that I play haven't studied all these openings, and if I've studied this and I know what to do after they play there, but then they play here. Now I'm not sure what to do. Now that gives me an advantage. It says now I can just take this pawn. I'm not sure why, because they can just take back. And again, we're not in the 4 knights Scotch because they didn't get that other knight out. We're now in the 3 knights opening. So if they do get this bishop out and Stockfish says I can take that pawn even though it's defended. So let's say I do that and they take back, which is by far the most common. And it looks like they've gone up a piece for a pawn. Now it says I can play d4. Okay. I understand d4 because my queen's back here. And if the bishop takes, I would just take with my queen and then we would be even on material, right? It says that's the most common response actually by black. The best move, of course, is for them to move it back this way. But their second best move is to take, which Stockfish would count as a mistake. I assume that's because I would take back. And again, we didn't go into the 4 knights Scotch. I was just showing how we might end up somewhere else. But I didn't know that it was my best move to take that pawn because it looked protected and I would lose a knight for it. I could end up getting this back here, and they're going to play d6 to defend their knight. I'm going to move this bishop here, really blocking my queen's retreat? What it said. The best move, the most common move by far, we're already down to 160 games here, so the chances of me reaching this position are really low. Let me back up to where we could have reached the 4 knights Scotch. Let's say we do get to this position someday when I'm just on a whim, I got that second knight out instead of playing the Vienna or the center game or one of those other things that I've been talking about. Let's say I did play these 2 knights and my opponent played both of their knights. d4 is my best move, and now we're in the 4 knights Scotch. And their best move is to take, and that is most common. So I would take back with my knight, right? That makes sense. It's guarded by my queen. If they take back, which is not the most common move, but it's close. Taking back is the second most common move by a very close margin. The most common move is bishop to b4, which pins this knight, and thus it undefends this pawn. And Stockfish says that's the best move. So they do that. Okay, then I take here, which is going to double one of their pawns, whichever way they choose to take. I think most people would probably take with the b pawn here, but I don't know. But now we're back to even. So let's say they did take here. I get this knight out, which defends that pawn and that one. Now they should castle, and I should castle. And we're about even. Okay, this seems playable to me. And I guess it wouldn't hurt me too bad if my opponent recklessly took this knight and I took back and I would have doubled pawns here, but they would have doubled pawns here too. It says their best move here would be d5. Well, that makes sense because if I took, they would undouble their pawns. And it says I would take. And again, we're down to just a few thousand games here. So I would take and they would take back. So they've undoubled their pawns now. But now I can pin their knight. All right. Well, this one I think I will consider just because all the moves made sense, except for the one place where I wasn't sure. Oh, but the one place where I wasn't sure was at it when they didn't play into the 4 knights. It's when they brought the bishop out. Okay, but once we get to this position, it makes sense to play d4. And I have knights controlling center squares, right? And squares on the other side of the board. So both those pawns are protected by knights. That pawn's protected by the queen. This bishop has a path out. This bishop has a path out. And I'm pretty close to being able to castle. We'll just have to clear up the matter of this D versus E pawn here first, which most of the moves there look relatively obvious. So I could see myself playing this. I guess I should try it a couple of times before I dismiss it outright, just because unlike the Ponziani, this one doesn't have any of those fears of this diagonal being open because the C pawn is still here. If I ever had to go somewhere with that knight, I can always block a bishop or queen check with the C pawn. And I'm a lot closer to being able to castle. So I'm going to put this on the maybe list. But now I'm going to look at the two that I got the most suggestions, which was the Vienna Game, which one of the people who suggested the Vienna Game was one of my longest time subscribers, Anderson Connors. Subscribed to the channel back when I had maybe 20 people watching. And we've had contact on the internet long before I started this channel. So thank you, Anderson. And also Zork Chess, and maybe a couple of others that I missed, suggested the Vienna, which I know that the Vienna is getting this knight out here now. I want to look at the opening book and see how common that is. Knight to f3 is the most common, bishop is second, third, fourth, fifth. Okay, it's the fifth most common second move by white after e4, e5. Now, unlike this knight, unlike knight to f6, knight to f3, which attacks a pawn, this one doesn't attack a pawn, it defends a pawn. The most common follow-up moves here are either one of these knights out. Stockfish says they're pretty close, and the database says knight to f6 is a little more popular, but knight to c6 is also fairly common in the opening book there. And so if either one of those gets played, I could always play this, and then they played the other one, and then we're in the 4 knights game, and we transitioned into it. But right here, we're in the Vienna. Okay, and if they do play this, well, see, Stockfish is recommending the other knight out now, but I thought here the Vienna Game was to bring out the bishop to c4. That's the third most common move here. Does that... Oh, already we're in the Falkbeer variation just by them having moved that knight out. I could be wrong about this. Is this no longer... This is now the Stanley variation of the Vienna Game. I do know that it's an old one, maybe not as old as the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game, but it's been around a while, probably 1800s or before, as have most of these E4 openings. They've been studied more in depth than most of the D4 openings. This is the Stanley variation. Okay, and what I should expect here, both from Stockfish and the opening book, is bishop to c5. Well, then if I get my knight out and I get my knight out, we're in the Italian game, right? Or is that the quiet game? If I pull this out and they play knight to c6, yeah, we've switched to the 4 knights game Italian variation. Okay. And then if I play d3, yep, that's the Italian game, sometimes called the quiet game, because I think that's how that translates. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Italian. I do remember that because right after I got back into chess, I bought a book called Modern Chess Openings, and I went through parts of it. So I do know that there's transpositions here. Okay, well, what does Stockfish recommends knight to f3? I think if I play this pawn now, is that the Vienna Gambit, or does the bishop have to be out first? Okay, that is the Vienna Gambit. I have heard of that. I think maybe Gotham Chess mentioned it in a video, and they shouldn't take. I remember that it's at least an inaccuracy if they take. I think the problem with them taking is that I can then push my e-pawn forward, and what they should play here is d5. Now, if they do, I take here, right? Yeah. But then they can take this. Either way, it says it's much better to take with the knight. Why? Why is it so much? Oh, because the knight's under threat. That makes sense. Okay, so it's much better to take with the knight, because otherwise I'm gonna capture their knight. Okay, so they take this pawn with their knight, and I don't take back. That's my third best move. My best move is knight or queen to f3. Interesting. But then wouldn't they take here? If I play queen to f3, they might take here. It's not horrible. That is the most popular move in the database. Their best move, according to Stockfish, is to get this knight out, which I guess attacks this pawn. And it's still not my best move to take here. My best move now is to pin that knight. Now it's their best move to take here. Even though it's usually better to take inward, it says Stockfish thinks it's slightly better to take outward this time. Well, and again, we're 6 moves in, and the chances of reaching that exact position against the opponents that I play are pretty slim. But at least I did know that that was the Vienna Gambit. I know that all these openings have many variations here. I just know that it becomes the Vienna Game once you play that. And again, if we bring out both knights, then it transitions into the 4 knights game and possibly the 4 knights Scotch. One thing I don't like about the Vienna Game is that it delays the castling. Because castling more quickly was one of several factors that made me decide to switch to e4 rather than d4. Because again, in the d4 openings, castling comes much later, especially if you want to castle kingside, because you haven't gotten space for that bishop to get out yet. So when you play e4, one of the ideas, in fact, of playing e4 in the first place is this bishop can get out immediately, which the bishop game, backing up, is one of the openings. It's the second most common second move here by white. But I mean, it's just a different order of playing the Italian game, I suppose, especially if the opponent plays here and I play here. Well, we've just gone into the Italian game, right? I will have to look maybe at some Gotham chess videos, maybe somebody else's, maybe do some reading on just various websites to see what, if any, is the advantage of the Vienna over playing in toward the Italian game. I mean, I know that the idea is the same as getting any knight out. You're going to control some center squares, you're protecting this pawn, and you're still leaving open your option of getting the other knight out, depending on what the opponent does at this point. And I suppose, depending on what they play, you still have the option of playing into the center game here because your queen is behind that. And obviously not if they put the knight on c6, because then they would have two defenders on that square. I definitely want to give the Vienna a closer look, especially since it looked like it was the fifth most common second move by white. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Queen to h5 is the sixth most common, and d3 is the seventh most common. What's that called? The Leonardus King's Pawn game Leonardus variation. Now, it's almost like the triangle thing, except over here, because I know with some d4 openings, you try to get this triangle on those dark squares, but this, with the King's Pawn opening, are you trying to get the triangle on the light squares? Or maybe not trying to get the triangle, I don't know. It looks very slow and passive and defensive to me, so I probably won't even consider that. And no one suggested it. I just clicked on the book move here. But anyway, with the Vienna being the fifth most common, I kind of like that idea. It has 6 million plays compared to 105 million who played this. Knight to f3 brings up 105 million games, whereas knight to c3, now we're down to 6.5 million games. So like 1/16 or something, the number of games. So the opponent's not going to see this nearly as often. Well, and the one that most people recommended, including longtime subscriber Peter Sonde, known as Only Me, and Stacia, is it Stacia Melenda, and maybe others that I missed when I made this list, recommended the Italian game. Not necessarily playing it, but both of them said it's important to know it. And I guess the best way to know it is to play it. And that's if I play here and my opponent plays here. They might not, but if they do, then I put my bishop on c4. I know that's the Italian game. I believe it might have been the first opening that I knew had a name when I realized openings had names. And I think here the most common next move is their bishop out to c5, and then d3 is what Stockfish says, but c3 is what's recommended by... Sorry, no, c3 is the most common in the database here. That's interesting. But Stockfish is saying d3 is slightly better. I wonder why. And sometimes the numbers change after you play them, so I'm going to watch Stockfish's number. After I play that, it drops to 0.1. Okay, well, what about the other one? 0.3. Well, no wonder more people are playing that. Because here, d3, the number's reversed. That one said 0.1 and that one said 0.3, but after you play them, the numbers reverse. And that might be due to the well-known inability of Stockfish and other computers, other chess playing computers, to handle openings. It seems they do much better once pieces are out and developed, and then calculating where those pieces could go. At least I've heard from pretty serious, knowledgeable people that these chess computers are not that good at openings. And certainly the computer seems confused here, because once you play the moves, the numbers reverse. Okay, so c3 is the most common option here. No, sorry, c3. Now we're in the Italian game classical variation. And the opponent will probably play knight to f6 here. It's very likely. Now I play d3. Well, interestingly, the book here says d4, but Stockfish says d3. We're going to have another case where the numbers reverse. If I play the recommended move, it drops to 0.1. Okay, well, let's try the d4 then. That's crazy. It went to 0.2. Backing up, yeah, d3 has the higher evaluation here than does d4. But once you play it, they reverse. Okay, well, that's something to be aware of. Either way, it's very close to even. I'm not sure I like d4, though. It says that's better, but I could be counting wrong, but doesn't the opponent have more pieces attacking that square? No, because I already played c3. I have 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking that square as well. Well, but I haven't castled yet. Castling's a very rare third option, according to the book, but not even mentioned by Stockfish. The engine definitely thinks I should play the d-pawn somewhere before castling. Well, that kind of violates opening principles too, doesn't it? Breaking open the center before you castle? And it says they're definitely by far their best move to take. They won't do anything else. And then I don't take back. I can. But despite having all the material that I just mentioned pointing at that pawn, I'm not supposed to take back. I'm supposed to push now. And so are they. Their only move that doesn't fail is to push forward. Did I read that wrong? I did read that wrong. Their only move that doesn't fail is to push this d pawn. Okay, this is very similar to the position we reached in the Scotch Gambit, where when I had a pawn here threatening their knight, they were supposed to throw another pawn here threatening my bishop. And again, I'm not supposed to take it en passant, and I'm not supposed to take the knight. My best move again is to move over one and pin this knight. Okay, which means they can't take that pawn, but now they're going to move this in here, which is very similar to what happened in the Scotch Gambit. Okay, that's something I'm going to notice more and more as we go along, no matter which opening I play, is that we're going to transition, or transpose from one opening to another, or reach positions that are very similar. This will be very similar to the position we reached in the Scotch Gambit, except I've played c3 here, I think is the major difference. But there were definitely a couple of spots that we just reached where there was an only move, especially for black. Yeah, right here, this was an only move for black. Anything else would have been at least a mistake. And here, that's an only move. Anything else would be at least a mistake. But I didn't have those. Black did. Yeah, I'm looking at the list each time. Okay, there were a couple of places where black had an only move, but white never did. Well, that recommends it, especially if by move 6 or 7, my opponent has to know only moves or figure out those only moves. By only move, I hope it's obvious that I mean the only move that works, or the only move that doesn't put you at a severe disadvantage, and I don't have to find him that early. Well, I paused the recording for some time. I realized the video has gone on quite a while now, just like the other one did. But there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot that I've probably seen before. I've seen in other people's games. I've probably been on the black side of those exact positions before when I was playing e5 with the black pieces, before I tried the Scandinavian, before I tried the Caro-Kann defense. But that's been a while. And I'm sure I've seen some of those positions with the white pieces a couple of years ago, before I decided to switch to d4. So I don't think any of it's going to be crazy new to me, unless there's a gambit involved or some sort of trick or trap. But just as with the d4 openings, I know I'm going to run into some tricks and traps. I know that people probably have videos out there how to beat the Vienna in 7 moves and how to win against the Italian game or things like that. I'm just going to have to learn to spot those when they happen. I think, as I've probably mentioned, maybe even in this video, one of my goals here is to try to just follow opening principles, no matter which one of these openings I choose. And as I said earlier, I am leaning toward the Vienna, just because it's slightly less common, although it can turn into the others. But one of the opening principles, besides getting some control of and occupation of center squares, is of course getting our pieces out to useful, safe squares, and then getting our king to safety, which is one of the reasons that I switched to e4 in the first place. Again, hopefully not repeating myself too much, but I'm never sure what I might have said 20 minutes ago, or whether I thought about saying it and then I forgot to say it. So that definitely lends itself to the Italian, because if I do the Ruy Lopez, they push that A pawn, and then I have to move the bishop again. Then they push the B pawn, I have to move the bishop again. That's one thing I don't like about the Ruy Lopez, is it immediately breaks that opening principle, and I'm just running my bishop around the board. If I wanted my bishop to be chased by pawns, I could play the Ruy Lopez, but if I just wanted to get it out where it can't immediately be chased by pawns, then I would play the Italian, which makes sense. And I could still end up playing something like that if I started with the Vienna, again, depending on what the opponent plays. Also, I think one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to see which of these positions has the most studied lines on them, because the ones that have the most studied lines are going to be the ones that people are going to be more familiar with. Probably. The reason that they're more studied is because more people play them. More people have tried those positions before. At least I think so. That makes sense, right? And so I'm just going to guess ahead of time that the Vienna will have less pages in that Modern Openings book. You know what? Let me go grab it. This is the book I'm talking about. Modern Chess Openings, 15th edition. I bought it a couple of years ago, or I think early in 2021, before I started this channel, but after I had begun playing chess daily on chess.com and Lead Chess, because I saw from these opening explorers here on the site that, wait, these openings have names. And then reading in the forums, I found out, that there's a book. So I ordered it. But anyway, there's about 8 pages on the Vienna game. I don't know if you can see that. And you can see that it lists several different variations in columns. And it does the same thing on each page, depending on the opponent making a different move or different options for white, as the case may be. Now, I didn't count, but it looks like there's about 40 pages on the Ruy Lopez, which tells me that there's just so many lines there that I'm probably not ready to study all of those. It doesn't look like there's that many on the Italian game either, maybe about the same as the Vienna. So those two look like they're probably in high contention for me. Yeah, and there are far more pages on the Caro-Kann defense, the French defense, the Sicilian defense, and the Ruy Lopez, which seem to be the ones that have been the most studied out in this book. But not that many, oh, here's the Ponziani, sorry. But not that many on the Vienna game or the Italian game. Surprisingly, I thought the Italian game would have a lot more pages. There's Philidor's defense. Does anybody play the Philidor anymore? I remember hearing about that. I think I played it by accident a few times when I first started playing chess again. And I know I've gotten into versions of the Scotch game and the Four Knights game and so on, purely by just getting pieces out, not intending to actually play those named openings. There are a few pages on the Petrov, but that depends on black. I can't force a Petrov. So anyway, if you were waiting on it, I'm just making the snap decision right now to start studying the Vienna game relatively seriously. Again, that's when black responds to e4 with e5. Obviously, if they respond with something else, then this isn't the Vienna. It's the Sicilian or the Caro-Kann or the Scandinavian, whatever they played. But if they play e5, then I can go into the Vienna with this, and I can be ready to transition into one of the other named openings like the Scotch or the Four Knights. I'm going to play an e4 game next time I get the white pieces, and it's going to be the Vienna. So hopefully something will come of that, and hopefully some of you got something out of this video as well. Thank you for spending your time here. I'll see you next time.